for joining us in this session, and thanks to the German Marshall Fund for hosting. My name is Clayton Aldern. I'm here as a data reporter with GRIST, which is an environmental and climate justice magazine based out of the United States. And I'm so pleased to be discussing climate justice with our panelists today, whom you see two of right now. We have some technical difficulties with one of our panelists. So if you see a new face pop up on your screen over the next few minutes, don't be alarmed. Donnell is supposed to be here. So with that, I'll just very briefly introduce the two folks who you do see, and then we can kick it off from there. So I'm very pleased to be joined by Harriet Lamb, who is the CEO of Ashton. And you're also looking at Johnson Serta, who's the director of the DGM Global Executing Agency and with Conservation International. We will, in theory, be joined at some point by Donnell Baird, who's the founder of Block Power, which works on energy retrofits in the United States. All of these folks, as perhaps is the theme of the Brussels Forum, have extremely impressive biographies. I'm not going to go through them right now. And instead, by way of introducing the rest of the folks in this room, I'd love to pose a question to each of you. And in that question, perhaps you could just shine a bit more light on what it is you bring to this conversation in terms of how your work relates to the broader theme of the discussion today, which again is with respect to elevating climate justice in the foreign policy narrative. So the question is, right, as a means of introducing yourself, I'd love if you could just offer your own definition of what constitutes climate justice and how you're currently seeking to further it, right? And let's just maybe start with Johnson and then move to Harriet. And if Donnell joins us, we can do that. Otherwise, we'll loop him back in. So please, Johnson, what is climate justice to you?
Oh, thank you, Clayton, for the invitation. I learned that question. Okay, let's start with this. I would say good question first. Second, I'm from an indigenous community in Ecuador, from the Ecuadorian Amazon. And I've been for many years, involved in the struggles and challenges that we have had in the Amazon with us indigenous organizations there. But I think in order to let the audience know, it's important to perhaps share the information that we are as indigenous, more than 476 million indigenous around the world. And this is according to the information we have from the International Labor Organization data, that latest data that we have. So then I like to say that, first of all, that if you look at the current situation in the communities, the climate impact and then the policy decision from the government, what has created is actually a climate injustice for us in the communities. But seeing that I remember that in 2000, as indigenous peoples, we have decided to assess, in one side, the impacts of climate change, in other side, also the decisions taken by the governments in this international climate convention. And, the conclusion was that those decisions were affecting to us as indigenous peoples in many different ecosystems because of the, afforestation projects and some other projects that were affecting communities. So then we have decided as indigenous to work on climate justice, to participate on this international discussion on climate change and propose our own or our main concerns there. For instance, we've been advocating since 2000 there. First of all, the recognition of the participation of indigenous peoples in the discussion at international level on climate change convention. And then let's say like four interesting elements. The first one, the free, prior, and informed consent, which is a key element in order to let the people say if they are fine implementing any kind of projects in the communities. I'm talking about the climate, related projects. And the second one is the recognition of the governance systems, because we do have in the communities, we are well organized in the community. We have a governance system, we have community level organization, national level, even international level organization. We we have demanded that we need that recognition in order to have, to achieve this climate justice. The other thing is very, very, very important is the land titling process. That is key for us because in the absence of the land titling, we have seen a lot of deforestation happening, and we've been fighting against some, policies from the governments, colonizers also going to our lands, but land titling is helping. It's proven, that land titling is helping in order to avoid that deforestation. So I would say that, those basic demands from indigenous peoples are in the international policy arena in order to, work in terms of the climate justice.
That's great. And I want to come back to these demands in just a few minutes. Harriet, perhaps first, you can answer the same question. What is climate justice to you? How are you at Ashton currently working on it?
I guess climate justice puts the least developed countries and marginalized people in wealthy countries center stage, and ensures that action to address the climate crisis is also addressing our inequality crisis. So at Ashton, we're a climate solutions charity, and we seek to further climate justice by highlighting the positive solutions that are already out there and which can have exactly those multiple benefits. So for example, highlighting community groups in the UK who are improving or retrofitting social housing. So generating jobs, giving people skills, enabling people on low incomes to have cozier, warmer homes and lower fuel bills, and also reducing their carbon footprint. Or, for example, highlighting and supporting initiatives in the developing world that are enabling people that still don't have access to energy to have access to renewable energy for the first time. And just one other thing to mention that we're doing, we've also sort of really responded to the energy of young people for change and their real calls for dramatic action to address the climate crisis. And so we just launched a campaign in the UK, which we hope will also go globally. In fact, there's already a pilot in the US called Let's Go Zero 2030. And the aim there is to say, how can all our schools across the whole of the UK reach zero carbon by 2030, which means addressing the heating, the energy, the food, the travel, the waste, and crucially, the curriculum that will give our young people the skills to be the leaders of the future.
Great, excellent. So speaking of climate solutions and getting to zero, I see we're also joined here by Donnell Baird, who's with Block Power. Donnell, happy for you to be here. It looks like wherever you are is extremely beautiful. What is climate justice to you, and how's it showing up in your work?
Yeah, I mean, I'm really glad to be here with all of you all today and to learn from others around their work and focus on climate justice. For us, we need to make sure that the worst aspects of climate change are averted. And so the foundational element of climate justice is we need to resolve climate change. And then beyond that, we think that the way to do that operationally, as well as ethically and morally, but like operationally and from a policy perspective and from a mass market business perspective, how do you, as was just said, prioritize the needs, purchasing patterns, the lack of infrastructure, the lack of economic equality that unfortunately is far too pervasive in the US and around the world? How do you make sure that the solutions to mitigating climate change solve the broader and more immediate problems of economic inequality? And I'd actually argue that there's no path or option to resolve climate change at scale in a significant way unless you have the broad base of support of voters and consumers who come from financially underserved or economically disadvantaged or historically disenfranchised communities. You just won't have the volume of customers, consumers, projects, users that you will need for renewable sources or alternatives to fossil fuels. You just won't have the volume economically that you need without a climate justice oriented approach. I guess I've lost track about what the non-climate justice approach would be. I think, I'm on the board of the Sierra Club. Sometimes we'll have these meetings where the environmentalists will say, well, we're just going to come up with a good solution technologically, and then we're going to, like, the elites in the policy world or the government or the business world are going to impose that solution on everybody else. That's just a fantasy world. That's never going to happen. I mean, that, at least in America, certainly, but certainly with the populist uprisings across the world, we saw the folks in France, there is not going to be a top-down imposition of a green economy to move off of fossil fuels. That's just not going to happen. So climate justice is the only path that we have. It's the only viable option. And I don't really spend a lot of time thinking about what the alternative options would be, because they're just not realistic.
Right. Well, you're preaching to the choir a bit. I work for a climate justice and environmental justice magazine. So I also feel quite embroiled in this ideological scope, right? As we kind of like to say, there's an intrinsic reason to pursue climate justice, but there are a whole lot of instrumental reasons to pursue climate justice as well. And I just want to stay with you for a moment, because I'm thinking about the folks on this panel, and I'm thinking about the audience. And not everyone here is a foreign policy practitioner per se, but a lot of people in the audience are. And you mentioned a group like the Sierra Club. You mentioned some economic relations in France. I'm just thinking, Donnell, where do you see policy priorities per se like show up in your work? Where's policy entering the conversation for you?
Well, policy and foreign policy, right?
Yeah.
A couple different ways. In America, we've got this Appalachian mountain range that a lot of coal has been extracted from over the last several decades and really powered our industrial revolution. And coal has collapsed. Thank God. That industry is and has and continues to collapse in America. And so there's a lot of stranded infrastructure. There's a lot of stranded workers in politically important parts of the United States that are part of the hardcore pro-Trump. There's a pro-Trump kind of fake populist pro-fossil fuel alliance that comes out of this coal belt. And folks have proposed a Marshall Plan for this region of the United States that, similar to, the prior Marshall Plan that we're talking about here, that we would have a new Marshall Plan for clean energy infrastructure and engagement in this region of the United States to convert it from a formal fossil fuel powered economy in this region to a clean energy powered economy. The swing state senator in the United States Senate, Joe Manchin, is from this region of the country. And so whether you want to talk policy or domestic American politics, this idea of a Marshall Plan for clean energy infrastructure in fossil fuel regions across America is really important. So that's one part. When I first started out as a consultant to the Obama administration in 2009, working on green jobs and green buildings, one of the things that was really important was we were still at war in Afghanistan and in Iraq. And one of the things that we were told to talk about with reporters and policy community and stakeholders was this idea that greening buildings was not only good for the environment, it was not only good to create jobs, it was not only good to make people comfortable, but we were going to dramatically reduce the amount of foreign oil that the United States economy was dependent upon by creating a robust solar and green building sector in the American economy that overall would reduce the amount of oil that we needed to extract from the Middle East for the purposes of powering our buildings and vehicles. And in so doing, there would be a foreign policy benefit by giving us more leverage over our engagement in various Middle Eastern wars that in some way, shape, or form have something to do with fossil fuels. I think many of us would agree. So I think there's massive policy and foreign policy implications. I think the last thing I would say is, I think that progressives and environmentalists, including myself and Grist and all of us, under Trump, we made a mistake. Our job as American citizens who know that climate change is real, we needed to continue to say, well, damn it, if the Trump administration isn't going to comply with the Paris Agreement, we as cities and states, we will commit, not only publicly commit to continue to comply, but we will ensure compliance with the Paris Agreement as the city of New York or LA or the state of California or the state of New York, which are massive economies that are larger than most countries around the world. We could have continued a lot of the momentum and trajectory towards maintaining the Paris agreements. I'm glad we're all like back on track with the Biden-Harris team, but I do think that the commitment to not only achieving the Paris agreement, but exceeding it and continuing to set the tempo internationally for the US as a leader in climate innovation, in green infrastructure and hardware innovation and battery storage innovation. All of that stuff really matters because we need to provide a consistent global leadership role for climate and complying with the Paris Agreement. And so we do like to think of the work that we're doing, greening buildings in America, as having a lot of foreign policy implications based on the three bullet points I just outlined.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Harriet, it looked like you were going to jump in a minute ago. Did you have something to add?
Well, just to address your question, actually, and then I'll come back to the point that Donald made, I wanted to build on. I think from a policy point of view, absolutely critical is winning back the trust of developing countries. And I think we've just seen an absolute washout with G7 on the Cornish beaches. Nothing was delivered. There was no fine cash on the table. And it is now 10 years since the wealthy nations promised they would be committing to $100 billion a year to help developing nations cope with the climate crisis. And they simply keep failing to deliver those funds. And I think that is a critical failure, therefore, of trust. It will undermine trust for developing nations in the build-up to the COP talks, when we need every nation to come feeling that they can trust each other as we seek to every nation to raise their ambitions and their nationally determined contributions. So I think the first priority for climate justice is for that commitment to climate finance to be honoured. And I think within countries, we have the same problem, which is what Donald was referring to, which I would really agree with, that as we adapt to climate change, we absolutely have to take people with us so they can see the benefits. And as Donald said, the sort of gilet jaune cry was, you're worrying about the end of the world, I'm worrying about the end of the week. And so we have to make it clear how the policies to help address the climate crisis will also help people get through to the end of the week. And I think some of that is absolutely bottom up, as Donald was saying. It's about really engaging with people in a way that a multitude of civil society actions and initiatives can help do and help people trust and engage with climate solutions. And key among that will, of course, be that they see economic future, that they see there are jobs for them in the future, a future economy that has a place for them and where they can have new skills and new jobs. And in fact, some research that was done in the UK found that only 7% of people associated climate action with jobs. That's dangerous. We need to get to a position where people feel that climate action will give a livelihood to them, will give them a future. Because the same research showed that they're very positive if they feel that is possible, including quite conservative traditional people who are maybe dragging their heels on some of these issues. They feel positive if that is a proposition, but they absolutely don't see it yet. And I think that's where we can take inspiration from the Biden plan, that creating millions of good paying jobs that give workers the chance to join a union and bargain collectively, putting trillions behind that. I think that's really inspiring. And I think that's where the US and the EU and the UK can really come together to help crack this sense of climate action generating job skills and livelihoods, in particular for those communities who are currently marginalized or will be as we shift away from fossil fuels. And so again, you can build people's trust. But where I was going to disagree with Donald, but I think in the end he also came back to saying we do need those that needs big government alongside the bottom-up initiatives. You sort of need both.
Well, so thinking of this notion of both, right? You mentioned civil society action, you mentioned union jobs, right? Grassroots policy design. I mean, climate justice is a big field, right? In kind of including in its ideological scope. People aren't just thinking about geopolitics. Right, they're also in many cases working on the ground, on the front lines. So Johnson, I want to go to you in thinking, in particular, you raised this notion of elevating Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous demands to this broad global scale. But I want to kind of move back to that grassroots in particular, and I'm wondering, in particular, how do you see in practice these grassroots efforts or Indigenous efforts informing climate progress, but maybe more specifically, what bottom up actions or solutions are you kind of most excited about right now?
Well, thank you. Let me start saying that even we are as indigenous victims of the climate change in developing countries, because we are living also in fragile ecosystems. Indigenous people since many years, they have said that we have a knowledge and we want to contribute. So it was very clear in 92 that they said, we have this knowledge, we like to contribute to climate action basically. And the second thing perhaps important to highlight is the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, in order to to present what I'm going to say about what in the communities we are doing. We have seen that since the climate is impacting in the communities, using our knowledge, we are still contributing a lot. For instance, in the last pandemic of COVID, the knowledge of the communities came up and they have, created their own solution at the local level using medicinal plants and all of that, at the local level. That's one thing. Another thing related to climate change is that we have our own, calendars of hunting, fishing, and agriculture and all of that. We had to adjust, those calendars in order to adapt to the new realities on climate change. That's one thing. But what I see is that the connection with the international policy is that in the Paris Agreement context, that we have, the governments have created this knowledge platform to exchange the knowledge between indigenous peoples and also the governments. And that is an interesting platform that has been created where the main idea is to first exchange the knowledge, create this space for capacity building, not only for indigenous, but also for the states, because sometimes, from the states only as they want to come with Western view to impose to communities, but we are saying that we have knowledge, we want to contribute. So this platform is to do the other way as well in terms of capacity building and create policies, based on the experiences that we have as indigenous peoples. So what is going on now is that in each country, for instance, they have created their own platforms at the national level to bring that experience from communities into the national level. And in that frame, based on that, contribute to the global level with the best practices that we are having. These platforms are, being created in Peru, in Bolivia, and I've heard that they're exploring in Guatemala, in Morocco, and right now in other countries in Africa as well. So I see that indigenous peoples, we are from the communities doing a lot and connecting to the global level. But one more thing, in terms of the NDCs, right? As you know, the NDCs is the main vehicle to achieve, the commitment they have done, the countries have done with Paris Agreement. If you see the Paris Rule Book, they have included the participation of indigenous peoples in the mitigation and adaptation part. in the updated documents, we haven't seen, the participation of indigenous peoples from the beginning. So what we are doing is demanding that we need to be part according to the Paris rulebook, because they have included there the participation of indigenous peoples based on our demands as well. So we would like to do that. Otherwise, we're gonna continue doing like, this report, the shadow reports like we do in human rights cases. The same thing on climate change. That is, I think, not a good way to do. The government should include, as stated in the Paris rulebook, the participation. They should invite the participation of indigenous peoples in the preparation of the plans and also the reports back to the UN. So I see a lot of connection from the practice, using traditional and indigenous knowledge systems to the national level policy, and also connected to the global with the Paris Agreement through this platform and other spaces that we have also there.
Yeah, thanks. So for context, I'm in Minnesota just now, in the United States, and I'm just south of the Line 3 protests, and these are protests for folks' context around an oil pipeline that's proposed, and this is I'm currently sitting on Osheri-Shakoi land. Anishinaabe water protectors are basically calling folks to the shores of the Mississippi right now. So this is the kind of headwaters of the Mississippi, and folks have occupied and camped directly on the proposed drill site for Line 3. People are holding ceremony and basically seeking to protect treaty rights between native and non-native treaty partners. And the reason I bring this up, the reason I mention this is because I think, Johnson, you've touched really eloquently on this notion of knowledge and capacity building. But Harriet, I'm thinking about your claims and conversation around civil society action, for example, and direct action. And to me, the link between these conversations is somewhere in this notion of place, right? Climate change is this big, broad thing that crosses borders and generations, and it moves slowly, and it's kind of hard to wrap our heads around. But it does happen somewhere. It is rooted in place, and direct action is also something that happens in place. And so I'd love, and this is maybe just a question for the group, whoever feels compelled to respond, but I'm just thinking about this notion of place, and in particular, perhaps this notion of land sovereignty. And I'm wondering where it enters the equation for you, right? How does this idea kind of like help us make sense of climate justice and our collective movement toward it?
Well, I'm happy to jump in first and then hand over to Johnson and Donald, because I think that's a really great question, and I think it's really inspiring when you see how civil society movements have responded to the climate crisis and actually to the COVID crisis. It's really underlined that sense of place and people coming back down to their community and thinking, what is it that I can do in my community, in my school, for example, that will help contribute to tackling climate change? And I think people have got that energy, that enthusiasm, they want to do it. And so the job of the policy making, to go back to where we were, is to make it possible for them, to make sure that there aren't those barriers in the way that will stop them if they decide they want to bring more wildlife back into the school, or if they want to put solar panels on their community building, making sure that there are funds available. I see someone asked a question about the nuclear industry, and I think that's a very good example. The nuclear industry is heavily subsidized. Now, what if we switch those subsidies to renewable energy, which is already becoming cheaper and cheaper? If we put those subsidies for people in their place to help bring up renewable energy, that gives people a stake in the future, and it helps build up those much more localized, more democratized forms of energy and climate action. And I think that would also help us tap into people's knowledge. And I love that point, Johnson, because I think that's true globally, that whether smallholder farmers or whether people in Germany or Sweden or Brussels, so many people have knowledge about their area and what would be the best solutions, and enabling them to engage in place-based action can add up to a whole picture. But that whole picture cannot be only about the market and only about growth. And that again comes back to so we were talking recently to the Superior Women's Association in Ecuador, Johnson, and there was a discussion about scaling up climate solutions. And she was really clear, stop thinking about the market the whole time, stop thinking about growth the whole time, think about what's right for people and their health and their well-being, and going back to the traditional knowledge and skills that people have, for example, on agriculture, much more sustainable ways of farming in tune with nature, in tune with each place, not just going headlong for mass productivity or mass efficiency all the time.
I think, I think it's important to highlight that in the communities, we have our own community plans. We call it plan of lives, right? Or life plans or something like that in the communities where we have all organized, sometimes written, sometimes just we have been in the oral way, but we do have in the communities. I think it's important to be guided with that. But what we have seen is when the governments always want to implement something, they just go to the communities in order to impose something different to the plans that communities have. And that's why I've seen, in the Inter-American Human Rights Court, decisions taken that, according to the court, that, those traditional lands belongs to the communities, and therefore the countries, they need to implement a free, prior, and informed consent and all of that. It is clear. So that's why when I'm working, I'm working with Conservation International, and we have said internally here that we need to follow all the protocols in order to do something appropriate when we are working with indigenous peoples in terms of conservation and other activities there. Otherwise, we're going to end up in the human rights court, because they have given, to the reason, they say, to the communities in order to be implemented the consultation, appropriate consultation process to them. But one element also is important, that in my own experience, I'm working with a dedicated grant mechanism for indigenous peoples and local communities. It is important, for them to have direct access to the climate funds, climate resources, because in this experience, we have seen that communities, they have demonstrated that they can achieve, the goals of climate action perhaps in a shorter time than the governments. So it's important for the communities also to have access to the resources and implement the plans that they have in their own communities. That would be really fantastic in order to, respect the sovereignty of the indigenous peoples and their lands, because, as I said, they have their own plans. Perhaps only the resources are missing in order to make more powerful the contribution that communities want to do.
Yeah, no, thanks for that. We're speaking a bit about various scales and scopes of place, right? The national, the local. Climate change, of course, is something that also spans various scales of time. And we mentioned a few minutes ago, right? Something like a treaty, that's something that's broken over a century. But maybe a plan, Johnson, that's something that is proposed or flip-flopped on, right? That can happen over the scale of a year, right? And I'm wondering, in these various scales of time, and I want to go to an audience question here, and maybe Donnell, you've worked in policy and you've worked in the private sector. You've worked on various time scales, so maybe this is for you, right? So Callista writes that the problem with climate action seems to be because policies are designed for the short term, right? Maybe like every 4 years in terms of a political term. So in part, I think the question here is how do you fix that, right? Is this a matter of a collective board coming together? Do you have a targeted team? How do you ensure longevity across climate policies? How do we solve the time problem of climate policy design while keeping an eye toward climate justice?
First of all, I really appreciate the answers on sovereignty and land sovereignty, and the observation that you shared with us that climate change happens in real places, that where there are opportunities to alter the trajectory of local places in order to have the broader impact that we need. I think that's a really powerful observation, and I think there's a data journalism thing that we may be able to do around that, helping people understand the climate implications of particular places and opportunities, certainly around America, but also locally within their reach.
Hey, sign me up.
Yeah, so we'll follow up with you on that. I'd love to learn from you about how to think more about that. I like the Biden plan. I don't think it's perfect by any means, but as a initial massive down payment on climate justice, environmental justice needs domestically, and starting to move America towards a trajectory that is reasonable, and we have a shot at mitigating the most disastrous impacts of climate change. I like the Biden plan. I think that I like the fact that 40% of all of the dollars go into low-income communities that have been disenfranchised, whether that's indigenous communities, Black American communities, Latinx communities, low-income white communities in the coal mining parts of our country that have been neglected, that even prior to COVID had been assaulted by the opioid crisis, just decades of devastation intergenerationally amongst many of these communities. And I like some of the thinking that the Biden American Jobs Plan and really the climate plan components of that bring to bear on what's possible, both in terms of the initial amount of capital that is being invested, the ability to leverage additional private sector capital using the tax dollars in the federal government plan. I think that's important to get some kind of private sector involvement. We can argue later about the distribution of profits and all that kind of stuff and who gets to own it. I think that indigenous communities, Black communities, Latinx communities, low-income white communities need to own the infrastructure. So not only do we need to receive the resources from the federal government, but as we make investments in clean energy and climate solutions locally, we should own those infrastructure assets. So if we're going to build solar farms or wind farms or battery farms or factories or whatever it is, we need to own those factories and wind farms and solar plants in low-income communities in America. But the Biden plan allows us to kind of do that if we play our cards right. So I like that. And I do think that it's a 10-year plan, and there are some significant investments that are being made over a longer time horizon. Now, can we pass this plan? I don't know. That's a whole nother thing, right? And so some of the short-term considerations that the question is referring to, we may or may not be able to pass this plan. I do think that policymakers in America are starting to recognize that we need a long-term plan. Over 200 cities in America have passed long-term legislation that says this city needs to be 100% renewable by 2030, by 2040, by 2050. And so at the local level, we are seeing long-term planning. What's missing is the data and the resources, the money to help finance and implement these plans successfully. But I think the Biden plan gives us a shot. Now, if the Biden plan doesn't pass, we're going to need the private sector to step in and help cities across the country to finance the clean energy conversion plans that we have passed into law to convert American cities to clean energy over the next 10, 20, 30 years. The last thing I'll say is at Block Power, we are searching for American cities that want to go 100% clean energy, not in 2030, because that's like really far away, but like by 2025, 4 years, 100% clean energy. So we are very fortunate that we found the first American city that's going to make that commitment. 48 months, we're going to knock this out. We're going to move the whole city off of fossil fuels. And so we want to see more and more cities making short-term commitments around their long-term plans that are substantive. And so we're really excited about that.
Yeah, that's fantastic. What's the city?
Oh, I can't tell you. It's a secret.
Okay,
It'll,
great.
We'll announce it in 6 weeks. 6 weeks.
Good. Okay.
This trying to get us.
This is. I know. You know, we've got about 5 minutes left here, so I want to kind of combine what feels like perhaps my last question with another from the audience. And Donnell, you know, you've spoken a lot about the Biden plan and America, right? But we've got a group of kind of foreign policy professionals in the audience. I'm thinking about outside of the US, right? So Roman Rule has asked here, you know, there are numerous NGO and civil society activities and activists, but especially in countries that appear to be turning autocratic and per Obama, right? Like Poland or Hungary. Is there a serious effort on the part of the US and the EU to support and encourage these organizations and activists? And I want to couple that question with, you know, perhaps an even broader one, which is, I'm thinking about the US, and I'm thinking about larger groups of rich countries like the G7, which I think we can all agree kind of failed to offer anything substantively new on climate justice over the past week. So this audience today consists of foreign policy professionals from places like these, right? What do you want them to do after this conversation? And Harriet, why don't we start with you? I think maybe just 1 or 2 minutes per person. What's the next step for folks in the audience and for some of these countries?
Well, sorry to repeat myself, but it is to put the $100 billion a year on the table for developing countries to make those shifts.
Just really quickly, how do we do that? Like, who do we call? Who do we send emails to? Like, what needs to happen there, Harriet?
Well, I think the best thing we can do is to lobby the climate or the Treasury or the foreign affairs departments within each of our governments. And it's to really give that push to them. And I believe it's to use also the argument that if we want COP26 to be successful, we have got to show that we can not just make commitments, but we can live up to them. So that, I guess that's what would be the best way to help make sure that that happens. And that, in a way, is part of addressing the climate justice agenda in Glasgow. If we want to push it forward, we've got to show that we will deliver on what we promise. I think that would then include as well investing in nature-based solutions that Jonathan began to touch on, and the solutions that will generate the jobs, skills, and livelihoods of the future. And it's really pushing for that, which can again be win-wins for people. I think it's, so you want to go from that very top international level down also to really creating roadmaps so that individual sectors and individual places, civil society can help, for example, all schools be zero carbon by 2030 as a response to the calls of young people, or develop those local communities that can show the way. I think it's time to stop being scared of the fossil fuel industry. I think it's absolutely time to step up to the plate in terms of regulation. And I think we need to probably, for the foreign policy, small ask here, I think we need a new international vision, and we need a new international architecture that will address these interconnected issues and crises of climate, inequality, rising conflict, and therefore rising numbers of refugees. We know they're connected. We know that climate is an exacerbating factor of conflict. We know that conflict then causes people to have to flee their homes, and these are the connected crises. And simply our current global architecture is not up to the job and is unable to get the breakthroughs that we need. And I think if I was a foreign policy expert, that would be my goal, that I could have starting the new thinking, just as we did when the United Nations was founded. We're in an equal crisis now. What are the institutions we need of the future at a global level? And how would you stand in front of Greta Thunberg and the Greta Thunbergs of Brussels or Minnesota or Ecuador and look them in the eye and say that you've helped shift the agenda on climate justice?
Yeah, well, I think that's a great place to end. And unfortunately, we are out of time. I do want to thank the Brussels Forum again and the German Marshall Fund. Thanks to Donnell Baird from Block Power, Harriet Lamb of Ashton, and Johnson Serta of Conservation International and the DGM Global Executing Agency. Again, I'm Clayton Aldern from GRIST, and so very pleased to be having this conversation. Obviously, it's a longer one than we have time for today.
Thank you all. It's great to be here. Thanks, Clayton.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
You.
Bye-bye.